Rabbi.
Hi, Masha. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, especially because we have a holiday coming up.
We do. We do. Which holiday are you talking about?
To biSh'vat, the
Tu
holiday of the
biSh'vat,
trees.
the holiday of the trees. It's true. It's a
So
wonderful
I was
holiday.
wondering if you could explain that to some of our viewers who might not know about this holiday.
Yes, it is not for centuries this was a poorly known holiday. It was kind of revived in the 20th century. Um, so originally this is the day, it's called the birthday of the trees,
Hmm.
because in the Mishnah and the Talmud they say this is the date that you use to decide how old a tree is, kind of like a tax year, right? That if a tree is born is planted before this date,
Hmm.
then at this date it becomes, another year older. And the
Hmm.
reason that you needed to do that was because of tithing. Because there was a requirement to tithe from trees. First of all, there's a requirement that you have to let trees grow for a few years before you can take any of their fruit. And
Hmm.
there you had to tithe when it became mature. You had to tithe from the trees. So it was really a technical kind of, tax year kind of holiday. And it remained that way for a long time. And then people started to, well, in the Middle Ages, with the
Hmm.
rise of Jewish mysticism, people started to associate the trees and the earth with Torah and say that actually maybe trees reflect something about the divine, and that in engaging with the world, we're actually engaging maybe with the upper world. And so Tu B'Shvat became a focus there, and people started having this custom of having a Tu B'Shvat Seder, like you have a Seder on Passover, that have a Seder on Tu B'Shvat, and similarly drink 4 cups of wine. But each one of those cups would represent a different level of creation, from sort
Hmm.
of a base material level all the way up to sort of a spiritual divine level, all represented by the fruits of trees. And they would say certain fruits represent different levels. For example, a fruit that has a hard outer shell, like a
Hmm.
coconut,
Hmm.
right, would maybe represent something that is at a basic level. And people disagree
Hmm.
about what the levels represent. But whereas something that had a soft outer covering but had a hard nut inside might
Hmm.
represent a different kind of level, and maybe something that's completely edible, like a date. Maybe, I guess dates have something hard inside. So a fig where you can eat the seeds,
Hmm.
maybe that's a higher level. And so they would go through this ceremony as a way to sort of connect the material world with the spiritual world and the idea of getting up to God's realm, right? So that was sort of the Middle Ages Kabbalistic vision of what Tu B'Shvat was.
Hmm.
Then in the maybe late 19th century, early 20th century, people started to associate Tu B'Shvat with Zionism and the idea of a
Hmm.
return to the land. I said, well, the trees, if it's an important day for trees and planting trees, then we have to think about that as replanting the land and returning to the land of Israel.
Hmm.
And so people began having celebrations where they would actually plant trees in Israel on this holiday of Tu B'Shvat. And that is still something that people do. And sometimes people give money for trees to be planted on that date, and people go out and plant trees on that date. So that's another level of Tu B'Shvat. And then maybe in the sort of 60s and 70s in the United States, Tu B'Shvat became sort of the basis for a Jewish environmental movement to say that in considering the trees, we have to think about the whole ecosystem, and that trees are a good indicator of the health of an ecosystem, and they're also affected a lot, and what's good for trees is good for the planet. So Tu B'Shvat became again sort of reformed as a sort of, people, when I was a kid they called it the Jewish Arbor Day, uh, as a day for honoring the earth and for environmental activism. So all of these different levels of Tu B'Shvat, this is typical, I think, for Jewish tradition, they're all still active. So
Hmm.
people today will, very many people, including me, will usually every year have a Tu B'Shvat Seder.
Hmm.
And it sort of weaves in these different elements from the mystical elements and the idea of some sort of spirituality coming from these different fruits to maybe a connection to the land of Israel, especially fruits that grow there like dates and figs, to the idea of environmentalism and connecting with the earth and seeing our kinship with trees. All those things are active. I think maybe the one that's the least active these days is the original one. The idea of like, where, most people are not tithing from their fruit trees anymore to the temple, so that has become less important. So this is a thing that often happens in Jewish tradition. That's something that started thousands of years ago as one kind of thing has become transformed as people got interested in it. And also what's interesting about it is sometimes it was really big in one period and then got dropped for several hundred years and then was lifted up again in another period and understood completely differently. So that one of the things about having a long tradition is that these things can get reinterpreted and reinterpreted, and we're always carrying all of them. So in terms of like the way we talk about signs and symbols, we usually would say that the signs and symbols of Judaism are all overdetermined because they have all these different levels. And if people say, well, which one is the real one, Rabbi? The answer is, yeah, they all are. We just understand it in different ways at different times. And very rarely are we saying, oh, no, not that one. That's not a way to understand it, right? It's more like yes, and. These are all different layers of interpretation that we use.
Mm-hmm.